our next session, India's emerging welfare stack. India's welfare system has evolved from program-led delivery to rights-based legislation to technology-enabled transfers. As citizens need change, the challenge is about rethinking welfare as an integrated stack, one that combines design, delivery, and outcomes more coherently. This session will examine what the objectives of a modern welfare state should be, how new tools like cash transfers reshape the welfare portfolio, and what it will take to build more resilient, efficient, and citizen-centric welfare systems. I request the panelists to please take up stage while I introduce each one of you. Susan, Varun, and Pankri. Susan Thomas, she's a senior research fellow and co-founder of XKDR Forum, a think tank working at the intersection of finance, law, and public policy. She has contributed to major financial and legal reforms in India and previously served in advisory and research roles with the Government of India. She holds a BTech from IIT Bombay and a PhD in economics from the University of Southern California. Varun Agarwal, he's the co-founder of Change Engine and a serial entrepreneur, AI researcher, and author. He previously co-founded Aspiring Minds, India's largest job skills assessment company, which scaled globally and exited successfully. Varun also co-founded Fast India, a non-profit working with the government to strengthen India's science and research ecosystem by bridging institutions, industries, government, and the public. The panel will be moderated by Pankuri Seth. She's the co-founder of Project DEEP, where she leads research and program design focused on cash transfer and social protection policy. She brings over 15 years of cross-sector experience spanning corporate finance, philanthropy, and the development sector. Her work focuses on strengthening program design and delivery in partnership with governments and communities. Over to you.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for joining us for this conversation today. I think in the previous panels, we've heard a lot about how nonprofits and governments can engage, what are the different things to keep in mind, how to choose government partnerships and make them work. I think this session today is, slightly more zoomed out to say that what is it that I know one of the previous sessions spoke a lot about justice as well. And today's session is about what is it that we want to achieve. Like when we work with the governments, what's the ideal state? What is, when we think about welfare, how do we define it? What are the objectives? This conversation is not so much about thinking about the barriers to reach that vision, but actually just defining it. And I'll just give a little bit of context. So the welfare in India has seen multiple evolutions. We've seen movement from program-led delivery like your ICDS kind of programs to more rights-based like NREGA. And then in the past decade, of course, we've seen the DBT mission, which is a lot more focused on how do we make benefits reach citizens much more seamlessly and efficiently. What has happened through this transition is that more schemes have been added, more programs have been added, and that's given us really bulky portfolios. We are now at this stage with the evolution of DBT and this huge uptake in cash transfers, which are very efficient for the government and impactful for the citizens. There's a huge opportunity that opens up for us to again take a step back and understand what is it that the government's role is, what should be the objective of welfare, and then how do we kind of achieve it. And I think we have two great panelists who can help us navigate this conversation, and we will have some time at the end of a few points to hear from any questions that you have, any thoughts that the audience also wants to share. So I'll quickly start with the first question to say that, as welfare has evolved, so has the nature of social challenges that India grapples with. So to both of you, like, what do you think are some of the most urgent social challenges that we face as a country today, and how would you define sort of the government's role in meeting these, mitigating these? And just looking at some of the traditional objectives that government has had, which has remained common, which is human development like education and health, economic stabilization and growth. On those lines, what are some of the other objectives that the government should kind be focusing on now?
Okay, so I think that this is indeed a slightly different slant, Pankuri, as you mentioned. From what we've been talking about so far, there's a development focus where there are specific targeted objectives for programs that the government starts, like funding education or funding health. I think when we think about welfare, it is just saying we recognize that there are the unfortunate, there are the people who do not have support systems, and therefore welfare schemes, at least the way that I see it, and we should have a debate as to whether you agree, it's just the redistribution from people who have to people who do not have, right? So I think it's very starkly different from achieving an objective of education or health, etc. So I agree with you. Welfare is very different. It's a redistributive scheme explicitly. And there, we've always known that unlike the earlier sessions where philanthropy or CSR has got a role to play, government is the only one that has the funds, so to speak, or the power or the role in society to be able to do this redistributive function. So given that that is the case, and I agree with you, we've been grappling with two big problems in any redistributive scheme where I think that we're very different today as compared with many years ago. One is who are the people, that is the identification, and then how do we do the redistribution. And I think especially with the advent of technology and the kind of institutional changes that we've seen so far, there's been a sea change in what we do. So I think that that's where government has set up, has started from what you mentioned, right, with these cash schemes for women who do not have good health, or all kinds of different welfare schemes. To today we have a much broader set, and what you guys do at Project Deep so well, which is to say, argue for, if this is indeed the case, that we're doing redistribution, if there's a cash transfer that's going to a certain targeted population, then what are the different ways that we should think about delivering these things so that they have maximal impact for the beneficiaries? And I think that's the challenge that we face today. And today, because of technology, because of the systems that the government has set up, in terms of things like Aadhaar, which allows for a certain kind of identification, as well as the entire technology stack of payments, where today government schemes can actually deliver into Jan-Dhan accounts of people specifically, right? It doesn't have to go through any state department, any state government department. It just goes directly into the accounts of the people. So I agree with you. I think that in the manner in which government does redistribution today, there's been an incredible change in what we used to have before versus today. But then the challenge still remains as to, okay, who is the target audience? And I think that still remains something that all of us need to debate. And is the efficiency of transfer of payments happening as per target? And then what is the benefit that the people are getting, right? So I think that these are the challenges that we are still grappling with. We need to identify who it is that should be the beneficiaries, are they getting it, and what is the outcome, which is that are the lives of these people explicitly changing for the better because they are getting it. Does that work?
No, thanks. Yeah. No, I think, so I agree to much of what Susan has said, and I think welfare is getting money to people who don't have money, right? Said simply. I just think that there are some more, as you go deeper, there are more facets to it, right? It's money for what? Is it money just for smoothing income? Is it money for shocks, right? So you have social insurance schemes which help you get over shocks, whereas there are cash transfer schemes which help you smoothen your income. And I think the other twin goal is that, which is interesting, whether we'll qualify it in welfare or not, but either way, is that how do you continue to be able to give money or use, let's not just say give money, but do low friction interventions which make people do better economic activities and be able to sustain themselves, right? So how do we not only supplement their incomes in the short term, but in the long term make sure that there are less of those whose income we have to supplement, right? And if the government can look at those twin goals, and there's some instruments like one of the things which Project Deep kind of advocates is lump sum cash transfers, right? Which is that rather than giving small money every month, if you give big money, there is some evidence that people can be lifted out of poverty permanently, right? Or a cross section of people can be lifted out of poverty because they will invest that money in employment generation, asset building, and so on. So I think it is about balancing a few different goals, which is out there. One is just smoothing. We cannot say that, look, people have to become economic agents, and and that's where and I think that's where the trade-offs happen, right? Where what I mean, are you giving the money for if I am a state and I'm thinking about if I'm giving money for consumption smoothing versus giving it for economic activity, and there's a case that if there's more economic activity, finally you'll have to give probably lesser money if we don't have the continually rising inequality which we are seeing. So if we can give money to get more people economically active, that is also, I would classify that as welfare. Uh, and then you do smoothing of income, you then be around social shocks, and that's why I think it is a stack of different instruments which lead to both short-term and long-term objectives of welfare. Uh, and the question is that how do you create this balance of different instruments to unlock it? And we can discuss a little more what are different kinds of instruments the government could use. And I think one of the challenges is that how do you do it in a fiscally prudent way, right? And I think that's what a lot of states are facing this challenge today, right? And if you don't do it in a fiscally prudent way, then it looks like it's being just done for political gains, right? Which also kind of dirties the narrative around these schemes of being seeing them as doles to get votes rather than as economists understand and see that there is evidence on their use to lift people out of poverty. So I think that is one facet which has to be thought through, and I know you guys have done some work on that as well.
Thank you both for sharing that perspective. I think it actually fits really well because when you say who, Susan, what I hear, and we've spoken about this before, is it's not so much a definition of poverty when we say who, but more of resilience and well being. And then when Varun talks about shocks and consumption smoothing and income smoothing, it kind of becomes a stack of when we say who. Like there will be people at different levels of vulnerability that need different kind of support, and the redistributive nature of the schemes or the programs that the government runs is what enables what should ideally enable that customized support, right? I think a important piece that we have also been looking at apart from the who and how is also the when, because there are different life like points in the life cycle of vulnerable individuals and communities where specific support is needed. We see that schemes have also evolved in that way, right? Like you see very specific schemes for housing, for example, very specific schemes for nutrition, and therefore it has kind of spread out into this multi-departmental, multi-scheme model, and a lot of benefits getting should be saturated on particular communities, but that creates the fragmentation, right? Like even from the government's end to be able to deploy, like Maharashtra, for example, has more than 2,000 schemes. Um, no organization privately, like if you think about a private organization and the number of products it can have, 2000 is just a huge number, right? But we expect that the government should be able to do it seamlessly for a much more complex problem and a much more intricate dynamic. You all have already touched upon cash transfers, which is what I do want to segue into to say that when we talk about low friction intervention, it's cash transfers has that potential. We've seen that multiple states, like you mentioned, have picked it up for different outcome areas, whether it is empowerment, nutrition, of investment support for farmers, but it still continues to be fragmented, right? And like Varun said, that so far there's a lot of mixed narrative around it because there hasn't been one sort of clear evidence-based narrative. Impact evaluation across welfare has been poor, like, but we haven't ever questioned what happens with housing schemes, what happens with nutrition. But now that cash is a stark sort of it's freebies as it's called, we're starting to think about impact now. So what has changed is a few things. One is this moving population of who as opposed to a static population. This new way of directly trusting or directly reaching the citizen, and that causing questions on like how much is it really benefiting. The how is what is slightly more figured out because of technology and other advancements we've had. And so while we've already touched upon cash transfers, I wanted to go a little bit deeper to say uh, what are the potential, what kind of potential does this model hold, and what are some of the risks that we should foresee vis-a-vis some of the existing or legacy schemes that the government continues to run. Maybe Varun, if you would like to start, and then.
I think so. With cash transfers, there are few different things I think we should demystify, and also government should take care of. One is, of course, we know, and you know this better than me, Pankudi, and if you can give some examples, that will be useful. But we know that there is global evidence that cash transfers lead to smoothing of income, better health, education, etc. outcomes, right? So that I think that needs to be publicized more, even though we don't have studies in India, but there is global evidence, and there is also global evidence around it lifting people out of poverty, right? And that discourse needs to be more publicized among people. If we go more deeper in cash transfers, I think there are a few things to worry about. Again, cash transfers, as you said, right? There are number of schemes which the government is running and different ministries are running, and they are in silos. And if together with that you are running cash transfers, it can cause various kinds of distortions, right? So a single household could be getting a cash transfer also, food subsidy also, electric subsidy also, and so on, which could create adverse behavior, right? So how do you make sure that, and the second example I would like to take is that cash, if there is no good public infrastructure in an area, cash transfers may not be effective, right? If there are no schools, no hospitals, no facilities, and so on. So you cannot see it as a silver bullet. So when we are looking at cash transfers as an instrument, it is to be seen on what other welfare policies the state is having. And within that, as Susan said, right, who can benefit most from cash transfers, right? If there's no infrastructure at one place, probably cash transfers are not going to be that effective. And the other side, that there is, you have to control these distortions which kind of happen. And I remember that there's one idea around housing IDs, right? Seeing these policies from household as a unit, which can help control some of these distortions. So I think those are some of the facets at a macro level where you see how cash is sitting with other schemes. I think the second facet is around good design of cash transfers itself, right? And we know that even what the name of the scheme is could perpetuate certain behaviors of it, right? The name of the scheme could be that most of the money is used for the marriage of a girl in the family, or even the timing. If it is just given before a festival, all of the money might be used for festival celebrations, right? So I think that many times these schemes are being named or timed based on the political advantage one can get out of them. They should be rather timed, named, and the frequency should be based on the economic advantage of that scheme or the welfare objective of that scheme, right? And more of that should start happening. Uh, and the objective of the cash transfer itself, right? And it may change from area to area, right? Is this cash transfer for smoothing, or is this cash transfer for buying assets and getting out of poverty, right? And I know that there's been discussions of hybrid schemes where there's some money which is going every month, and then there's some money which is going in as a lump sum, right? So these models have to be tried, right? So I think a state has to figure out what their welfare objectives are, and based on it, create these hypotheses of schemes which they would do, and then you need to have continuous measurement, right? So as you were saying that most of the times there are very little impact studies of it. So I think we need to do these impact studies and continue to iterate on these schemes. Anyway, as socioeconomics of different states also change, the schemes have to be changed, right? Like one example, I mean, you're saying that there are 2,000 schemes, right? There are still schemes, and we have seen it, which says that you have to give 200 rupees to this person annually, right? We saw this in the context of care leavers, people who leave care facilities, and there are schemes in state which says that give 200 rupees every year for the every next year. This scheme must have been made in the 1970s or something and still perpetuating, right? The cost of implementing the scheme is more than the money which you are giving out for welfare. So I think we have to summarize, the first point is that you cannot see cash transfers in a silo. You have to see it with knowledge of what are the other schemes, and that is a hard one because different ministries take out different schemes. I would say that a state should have a welfare policy, right? And then within that welfare policy, scheme should be designed or retired for the policy should say these are the objectives, these are the instruments, and should lay out some framework for it. That is one. Two, good design of cash transfer policies themselves. And three would be constant measurement and improvement.
I have a slightly different slant on this. Okay, so as long as we are clear that this is welfare, I think that what was what triggered off, so we did an analysis of the schemes that were proposed for Karnataka in July 2023. So there were some 5 schemes that were proposed. And ultimately, it had the nature of a lump sum going out to households every month. Okay? Primarily because the biggest chunk of it was Gruha Lakshmi, where every household which was headed by a woman would get 2,000 rupees a month. There were other schemes as well, like the electricity subsidy scheme, which effectively ended up giving 350 bucks to every household because the electricity consumption was then free. You didn't have to pay your electricity bill. So effectively, if you looked at the households, they were getting about 2,000 to 2,020 to 300 bucks every month. Now, what we were able to do was to ask the question, fine, we see this. It was an election promise. And now that we've got this terrific technology of being able to reach the money into the Jandan account of every household, it is getting there. So the two questions that we asked is it actually happening? So we know that earlier all schemes, welfare schemes, had this big question mark saying, does the state have the capability of reaching the money to the household? And we expected there was a lot of leakage in between. Today, if we look at the evidence, like it's super, right? They promised 2,250, 2,250 is reaching the account of the households. Then the question is, what do the households do with it, right? So what we found was that remarkably, the first thing that the households did was they paid off their debt. Okay, this says that number one, some of these households were taking on debt because there was genuine stress, right? And we, as either state or civil society, we cannot go into the household and ask what state you are in. Are you poor? Are you unhealthy? Are you feeling sick? But when this cash comes in, they tend to use it for the purpose that they need. Okay, and we cannot predict. And even no matter how powerful a state is, the households, so the household's problem identification by the state is not going to be possible. The household knows what it needs the cash for. So this is the one thing that we did. Then we saw some behavioral patterns in terms of consumption, which I think links to something that you at Project Deep has done, which is that if you're able to regularly get cash transfers into stressed households' hands, in the beginning, they're going to try to get out of the stress. But when that promise is credible, that you are going to get this money month after month, they start making more behavioral changes that are permanent, right? So I think that when I think about cash transfers or welfare schemes, you are correct in saying that there are 2,000 schemes across Maharashtra. Every other state has got multiple kinds of targeted schemes. They are silly, they are small, and we have no credibility in terms of saying, is the purpose of the scheme being satisfied by the cash transfer, right? Because there are so many schemes, so we cannot actually test it, even if we were to go out and test it. What we can say is that when there is this lump sum that's going into the household is indeed using it for the purposes that it requires, and it varies from household to household, right? So if we are to debate what should be the design of a welfare scheme from the state to the citizens, number one, identification of exactly what every household requires is tough. But what we find is that when you are able to deliver money into the hands of some underserved households, they are able to use the money for the purposes that they think fit. Now, on the outcomes question, I agree with you. What is it that we desire out of welfare? In the old days, we used to say poverty is a target, right? And so you had to identify the poor people, quote unquote, and then get some kind of welfare to them. We have now moved away from that, saying that we are going to go into finer slices of what welfare beneficiaries should be getting. It's no longer a poverty target, right? But we want to give the label of underserved or underclass very different labels and then be able to deliver to it. What we know today is that the state is able to deliver it. The question is, what do we as the citizens or civil society want to get out of it? So what is the definition of welfare is something that's clearly up in the air. Do we believe that everyone is going to be at some point or the other in need of some help? And we know this, right? That when a middle class family suddenly has its chief wage earner lose their job, at that point, they are used to a certain level of consumption. The income has dropped off. Are they people that all of us would agree would require some support until a time that they are able to come up to being re-participants or participants in the economy? So I think that this is a discussion that we all have to agree upon. But my problem is that unless and until when a state proposes a welfare scheme, unless it says this is what is the purpose that we are choosing to deliver, then for us to define outcomes is going to be difficult, right? So, I mean, I think that I have this wild dream that every time state government or union government announces a scheme, they should be announcing it saying that in 1 year we should be seeing exactly this so that researchers like us can go and measure and say, okay, you've achieved it, right? But I don't know whether any government is going to do that.
Sorry, so just to, uh, what's the point of difference? That's what I wanted.
I'm not sure that we have a point of difference, right? It's just that when we think about schemes or welfare schemes, I think that it's going to be very difficult to do targeted schemes.
So that's fine, yeah.
Right? So, in a certain sense, when you do cash transfers and you say that there are welfare schemes which effectively are cash transfers to a certain targeted population without an outcome, it's very easy to do administrative delivery.
No, I agree.
Right? Because the outcome will be there are these people, they can be clearly identified. Are they getting the money?
Yeah.
Now, when we go one step beyond and say, is it achieving the outcome for something or the other? I'm not sure that we can do it. That was my only
No,
point.
understood. And I think the question is, how do you define outcomes, right? And probably when I said, you could say that, look, we are smoothing income and that's the outcome, and you can study what the outcome is. But you need to finally, what I'm trying to say is that whatever the state needs to have a set of outcomes it's targeting, right? And finally, even if we don't know that by from the point of view of saying that, okay, we have that doesn't mean that I'm going to decide that I will give money for this to the household. The outcome can be an emergent property of a cash transfer. So that doesn't necessitate that, see, if the outcome is that everyone's nutrition has to be solved for, then I will give a food subsidy or I will make sure that the PDS has that. But at least there should be certain social goals in my mind, what the state sets out. And probably cash transfer is a great way, a frictionless great way to get to that outcome. And that's what measurement would tell us. And if the measurement shows that, look, I mean, to your outcome, cash transfer is able to solve nutrition, or let's say to 70%, then you need an augmenting scheme on top of it to fill it in. I know that it would not work that scientifically, but you need to have some objective, right, at the end of the day. But I'm not just saying that that objective means that you, like we understand this even in other areas, right, of computer science, that it's not that they're emergent properties out of systems.
No,
right?
I agree. But if you say that it's the money is being given or the welfare benefit that we are seeking is improved nutrition, but the household takes the money and pays off its debt, is that a good outcome or a bad outcome? My argument would be I think it's a good outcome because being in debt would stress the household. So even though they did not go out and get, I don't know, good nutrition, good food that we would consider good nutrition, but instead use the same money to pay off debt.
No, exactly. And there the outcome would be to coming out of stress.
That's correct, but we haven't said that is the objective of the welfare scheme, right? So the reason why they're getting the money is so that they can get better food mix in their consumption. But instead, they're taking this extra money and they're paying off debt. And so the argument is, and I think this is something that I've liked about the Project Deep's definition of untied money, that give the cash, don't label it, right? And then they take the money and they use it for the purpose that they find requires highest need at this point in time. So you're getting the money because it's PDS,
Yes.
or sorry, food security, or better nutrition, or better health, or women's needs, but they're paying off debt. I mean, we have to agree that this is a good outcome. That's my limited
Yeah,
point.
no, just the last point on this one, that I don't know why it is not a good outcome from my point of view. And sorry, I lost the trail of my thought.
I think the point is that when we, if we were to tie the outcome to a name of a scheme, it's exactly what you said, right? So
okay,
the
I
name of the
got
scheme is X. You're getting the money, and the outcome that we expect is X plus, right, or the X outcome. But instead, what we see is a Y outcome for the. So I mean, precisely this, right?
Yeah, so I just, my last submission on that is that we should look at outcomes on aggregate, not on outcomes on a household level, right? And when you look at outcomes on an aggregate level, there would be some signal, right? And then you will say that whether the signal is
perfect,
is
right?
achieving what you wanted it to achieve.
Yeah, and I think that this ties in really nicely. If you don't mind me continuing this line of thought, I think Varun's point at some point, one of the things that he listed was there are many schemes, and it's very difficult to administer. And this is Pankudi, you said exactly the same thing, right? That it's very difficult to administer to each of this and say, did we achieve outcome on all of that? But if you had the consolidated part, so there has to, and I think that certain officers of certain parts of the bureaucracy are already starting to think about this. That in states where you have 2,000 schemes, instead we should just collapse to maybe 5, right? For food security and for I don't know, whatever, right? So something like this. It is to your point, and the nice thing there is also that it removes the ability of the political masses or politicians to then start tweaking it and deploying it as. Thank you. Yes. So I mean, when you have a consolidated minimal number of, you have exactly that kind of outcome. It is useful though. I'm going to say it again. When people in stress get cash, perhaps we will not get the outcomes that the scheme was meant for, but it improves the livelihood or the well-being of the household, and that's something that we should be targeting. It's just that that well-being of the household could come through many ways. And that's the benefit of untied cash.
Yeah. No, thank you. I think it's spirited debate and kind of explores the different yet I would say the lens comes back to the fact that at a household level, uh, our scheme's making a difference, right? We might want to. I'm obviously a big believer of untied cash because it's also longitudinal, right? Like if you're paying off debt today, and it's almost like Maslow's in my mind. Like you will address the biggest stressor in your life first, whether that is debt or wanting a better roof or if it's directly food. But over time, you then see that as an aggregate, households are able to move up that trajectory and improve the well being, but the well being as defined by themselves, not this idea that we have projected. And therefore, the point on aggregate, I would just like to say it's also about long term, right? I think we also have a short term bias in saying that, okay, if money is given, I read a very nice New York Times article where there was a program which was unconditional transfers for new mothers. And the recipients themselves were supposed to kind of self assess and report back on how they think they did. And there was a very harsh self critical lens to it to say, oh, I didn't do the best with it. But that tall expectation to say that that one transfer should turn around their life overnight is only an expectation from cash transfers and from nothing else, which is very unreal. And so it just needs a much more long term lens to look at, even whether it is state programs on cash or otherwise. So when the question I meant is not scheme-wise outcomes, but as a whole, when we're trying to measure, all of us have scorecards. So if you had a government scorecard, how have they done on welfare? These are the 5 things they set out to do, and a plethora of schemes have been able to achieve it or not over the long term. Um, on cash transfers, very specifically, like Varun said, there is a lot of global evidence on not just monetary poverty, but also range of other outcomes, including human capital formation, including mental health. But we are also seeing emerging evidence from India, right? Like the work that XKDR has done in Karnataka. We have some evidence from West Bengal. We have a new study that's come out from Jharkhand as well, and all of that points to the positive direction that cash transfers are showing, right? Um, what we have seen through our own work, and Barun alluded a little bit to that, is the levers that can shift the direction or multiply the impact are very dependent on design, which is the frequency. The bigger one that I personally am most interested in is amount adequacy as well. Because with this whole mixed narrative, with this whole political conflict that goes on with cash transfers in the conversation, is that it has the big risk of going down the route of being tokenistic, that we are providing the citizens, but at the end of the day, if it's 200 rupees, what is that really solving for? And which is why it again circles back to saying that impact should be at the center of it, right? It's not just the action, but what is it yielding to? So I think that's the other points that I completely agree with is that it's not a silver bullet, like the public infrastructure pieces. That's the other debate, right? That are cash transfers eating into some of the economic and more productive investments of the government. But it's, in my mind, it's not a polarity. They do have to be kind of synchronous, because one doesn't work without the others. All the investments in public infrastructure, if people don't have the money to use it, doesn't help.
No, but I do agree. Like, I think that's another point that I think what Varun had said in an earlier comment is important to discuss and debate. That there's a cost associated. You said it yourself, but nobody does that calculation, right? So, and I think that's the bothersome part. So you've got all of these schemes. It might be 200 rupees for once a year to some person, but at the end of the day, it's a line item in the budget of the government. And when you add it all up, it comes up to a substantial part. And when you see that aggregated amount, that's when you say, okay, fine, the fertilizer subsidy is 0.4% of the budget. But then if we pay like the standard $0.50 a day to 20% of the population who are below the poverty line or what have you, it becomes 4.5% of the budget. And we have to get real, right? We have to say that 4.5%, are we willing to say that that's in addition to what we are doing with all the other things? Or do we have to explicitly swap it out? What is the legal instrument through which we may want to think about controlling the extent to which you can go beyond a particular threshold for welfare within the budget for a country which has have hard uses for that money in infrastructure? So what is the balance, right? Where is the debate? And I think that's the worrisome part in this, that nobody argues against a welfare scheme because we think that welfare is redistribution. We are okay with it. But there's a cost. And we don't debate the cost.
No, I just wanted the mic likes you more.
You know, in another session, every mic I touch dies.
No, I think, and to that point, Susan, I think the way I think about it is that you need a welfare policy, right? What would you mean by having a welfare policy would be exactly this, right? That what are the different instruments? What is the amount of budget you are ready to give them? What do you think are the outcomes it will drive? And when I say outcomes, it's not in the strictest sense of, I mean, to me, as I said, right, and to the point Pankhudi was making, that it's a Maslow's hierarchy, right? So getting out of stress is fine. Now the problem is that the government didn't conceive of the scheme as to do that, right? But I mean, at some point they have to be educated that, look, that's the first thing the scheme does, and that's a good thing that it is doing, rather than hiding, hiding from. Exactly, right? So I think it's okay to put it out, and there'll be some schemes, for example, just for the sake of argument, where you have more well-defined outcomes, right? Like if you look at the graduation approach, which is a high-friction approach, you'll say, oh, if we do this, we take people out of poverty, right? So there could be a mix of, and I'll not be a big supporter of that on a state scale because it's so high friction. But let's say there could be modifications to cash transfer schemes, and there's some evidence again that if you do communications of various kinds on mass media through mobile phones and so on and so forth, it leads to certain outcomes. So I'm just saying a little bit that we shouldn't shy from what the outcomes would be. And I think your worry is that if the outcomes are defined very strongly, then uh, people will make suboptimal decisions on the schemes.
No, I think that then you will be like the public debate will be that different things are happening while the money is with, and that's always harmful. It's harmed before, it will harm, continue. So we need to step away from the specificity. I agree with you on the outcome, but I kind of like the idea of a policy. I was thinking much more of a hard legal instrument like the FRB bill, right? Tells you that inflation cannot cross or beyond 4%, and therefore this is the amount that, or the fiscal deficit cannot cross beyond. Something like that for welfare. But you're right. I mean, it's in the hands of the state governments as well as union.
Yeah, exactly. That makes it more complicated. But I mean, I'll just throw it in and not well thought through this one. But maybe we even need a ministry for welfare. Right?
Oh no. We don't. We should calm ourselves from extending ministries or extending government. But
no, but we can merge 2-3 ministries and make it a ministry of
no,
welfare.
this is going to be a decision at the level of the finance ministry because they have to pay the bill. But let's not create another ministry. Civil society is there, no?
Yeah, we're a self-appointed ministry.
We'll ask Pankhudi for another debate on that one.
Yes, to be continued. So on that note, right, on actually love the idea of a welfare policy because even the cash transfer report that we did, right, was an attempt to map out all the cash transfers in the country, but also create a consolidated repository where design guidelines or budget guidelines can be there in a central location so that not everything is so scattered because everything is across states and union, you see that there's a lot of disparity even for the same outcomes. Here we're debating whether there should be outcomes or not, but there are so many approaches currently that the impact basically gets lost in a lot of, before we get to impact, there's a huge road that we have to cross. But on that note, we do have some time for a couple of audience questions before I can actually ask for last thoughts and summarize. So, there's someone here.
So when welfare policy was mentioned, I remember one instance. Well, there was one welfare scheme, and it was the fund was like very minority was utilized, and as like financially rendered, it went back to the government. Then a person took it in a mission mode. He visited few districts, create some campaigns, and took some volunteer help. And next year, the application came like 5x than the fund. So I see there's a need of this welfare policy there, and that scheme was actually the scholarships thing. Like student used to get this thing, and the government decided that now we got a 5x application. Now we will just provide 1/5 of the scholarship. So the entire household budget who was like dependable on the scheme, well, they were hoping that we will get that fund has do this thing. So what's your take on that?
No,
Huh.
so just to say that there's no gender bias. I think we'd have to look at it. I agree with you, right? And I think that this is a problem across most schemes. That when a scheme is proposed, if it does not have just the intention of saying I'm going to get a political limelight on me or some kind of a limelight by announcing the scheme, every scheme has to be budgeted carefully, right? This seems to me a clear case of a lack of budgeting efficiency. That when people actually found out about it, there was too much application, not enough money. And so it's not a well thought out scheme, but that's where we must recognize that state the lack of state capability exists in this country. So whatever it is that we propose as policy or schemes must take that into account. I think that's where we've seen the advance in terms of technology, that when you had this Jandan account, no matter what anybody thinks about it, the ability of a direct transfer into the account or the hands of the household clearly exists. But that also opens up the possibility that, okay, now it can be profligately used by any voice that wants to get some benefit, not equivalent to the benefit for the citizen. So I agree with you. All of this has to be tagged in terms of efficiency of schemes. It is very badly done today, and we recognize that. And the question I guess this panel wants to ask is, what should we do by way of some kind of bound? And I think it can only be civil society that does it. I mean, in your example also, some person took it upon themselves to go and educate people, and I'm sure it was not the government that did it, right? So exactly. So it's civil society that does it. Civil society has also got to start building the research like Project Deep is doing, in terms of saying how many schemes are there, how much is it budgeted, how much does actually get spent, how much is wasted, how much could have been, and so that wasted amount is stuff that can be spent on good works in that state government. So all of this is up to us. And I think that's one of the roles that we haven't really discussed in the governments and NGO story. Civil society, that's NGOs, have got a big role to play in just forcing accountability. I mean, this is public money. It's a consolidated fund of India, right? So it's up to us, though. The budget documents are out there. We need to be able to make the link.
I think we can maybe take another question.
Yeah, hi, myself Ranjana Srivastav from Udyan Care Organization. Uh, we work on family-based alternative care in different states, and under that, like we were having this discussion of the schemes, and somewhere sometimes it's also important that the purpose for which a particular fund is getting transferred, is it getting insured or not? Say for example, Sukanya scheme or Ladli scheme, the ultimate purpose is that to ensure the education of the girl child. Is it happening or not? So even yes, the amount may be 2000, 3000, whatever it is being given, maybe not the complete amount is going, but at least the partial or the purpose for which it is given, it should be ensured. So some kind of the monitoring or a impact of that should be there. Similarly, under the JJ fund, the Juvenile Justice Act fund, there is a provision for the sponsorship fund or the newly this thing, the aftercare funds. Not in all states it's being implemented, and even in the states where it's being implemented, uh, especially the sponsorship, when you will go on Mission Vatsalya portal and check, good number of funds are given to good number of children. It's a sponsorship funds are going from 2000 to 4000, it has happened. But then the consistency in that, and then the who is doing the analysis, the background analysis of that, and even is this the same beneficiary or the recipient for a long time, or it just that it started and after 2 months it discontinued and a new enrollment has happened, and what was the basis that the fund dropped to X beneficiary and continued or started for the Y beneficiary. So these are also the questions that we need to look when we are talking about the welfare stack. Thank you.
I mean, I can just comment on that. No, absolutely. And when we say that the impact of these schemes should be studied, we are looking at questions like this. Just one difference of view, and I think that was much of the debate here, which you kind of also spoke about. That the debate is around that when you do untied cash transfers, you are not able to control the usage of that fund for specific purposes. But multiple studies show that they are used in the right way towards quote unquote right outcomes, which we all struggle to define. Uh, so I think that's a policy choice, right? Because you can do, like, it's interesting the question which this gentleman raised, right? Like, we've used this word again and again without explaining it, frictionless transfer, right? The beauty of these cash transfer schemes is that they are frictionless. So much money is allocated for so many schemes, and that money is not even spent, right? The procedures to get money for schemes is complicated. People are There are now non-profits which just work on this, enabling people to get benefits of schemes, right? Like to your point, there's money which relapses for caregivers every year. There's provision of money for caregivers of 4,000, 5,000 rupees per month for 5 years after they're 18. And there is a DM is responsible to process some of this. The poor DM doesn't know what he or she has to do, right? So the I think, and that was kind of the big debate we were having, that if it is done for a very specific purpose and with lots of checks and balances, then it may have the reverse impact of what you are saying. Just the friction of implementing that scheme and having an outcome is very, very hard. Like one of the first things which Suzanne said was that the first thing is that the money reached the bank account at scale, right? And as obvious as it seems today, it's not been as obvious. So I think that is a very, very important thing in scheme design, right? When we put all these checks and balances, almost like anything, right? Like income tax law or anything, right? When you put all these checks and balances, you think that this will help you to get right purpose. It just increases bureaucracy and leads to no real outcomes.
I think just something to add is, I think one realization is that whether we look at it, poverty as a whole, or we break it down into like health, nutrition, housing, I think one of the realizations that is coming through is that it's just a lack of cash. Like, do you want to provide the cash directly, or do you want to purchase or procure whatever is required and deliver it? And that's where this entire idea of friction and frictionless comes up. I think for a long time, the idea of in-kind transfers and credit has been gaining momentum, which is now kind of being uh, countered with this advent of cash transfers, because you see that two reasons. One is that cash transfers also has a lot of mobility, as it circulates in the economy. There are many effects. We're talking about the direct effect, that we meant it for education but it's being used for Y, but it has multiple ripple effects that are also not being talked about, right? Like once you've addressed one stressor, what then happens in your life and those around you. That's one. And second, which Susan addressed briefly, is debt, because some of the things that money is being alternatively used for would have otherwise been used financed through debt, which actually just compounds the stress. So you've kind of not really, on balance, you haven't solved for anything. Going back again to the point on aggregate outcomes, right? Even if you've managed to address that particular thing with multiple conditions, what are the other sort of ripples or backlashes you've caused is something that we're still grappling with these things. I feel there has not been any way to look at a household's journey out of poverty through these multiple schemes. And therefore, the basic point being that cash transfers provides a way to do this in a much simpler manner. So I think that's Untied cash transfers is a way to do this in a simpler manner. Any other?
So, just want to know your thoughts on how, if through your advocacy or your work, how have you thought of this, mitigating this challenge of all of that power in decision making going to the man of the house or the patriarchal system deciding where this money goes? Like, what's a way to make sure the entire family unit benefits and everyone has a say?
You have seen evidence from it in your.
I can respond from our pilots and then. So, to be very honest, it's not as black and white as it appears. I know that the first thought is that it's a patriarchal system, the man will decide. But I think so we also do programs on field where we disperse cash transfers to families. Um, it's it's actually not counterintuitive to say that when there is so much vulnerability and deprivation, the decision making is for the benefit of the household as a unit, and it's not so important on okay, let me not rephrase that. It is important on who decides, but it's also important on what the benefit is. So even if the man decides but the benefit is for the whole family, I think that debate, it shouldn't be criticized to that extent, right? So I feel the global literature actually shows that whether you give the money to a man or a woman, the economic outcomes don't change. So that's on the economic side of it. Of course, on the social side of it, how do we make sure that there is more, engagement of women? Women are more included in decision making. That's something Susan touched upon. Is that again, those are long-term things. If you see sustainable cash flows going into a family, then slowly the intra-household dynamic also changes. But those are much longer, that you can't expect that 1 year of cash transfers is going to change that. And so I would look at it as a mid-term lens and a long-term lens. So again, going back to the idea of defining even a priority probably of outcomes, to say if we are targeting poverty, monetary poverty at first, and then all the outcomes have separate kind of lenses to be looked at, then it creates a much more holistic aspect, as opposed to just a binary of man versus woman, or that kind of thing. I don't know if you want to.
I mean, I'm just going to augment what Pankuri said. I think that we need to differentiate poverty stories from social stories, right? And I think that when you think about the household, the woman's account getting credited with 2,000 rupees. And technically she's got the agency, but the household makes the decision that it's better for the entire household to get stress-free by letting off debt. She may make the choice that now I've got the money and I'll pay it for school education, or better care for the elderly in the household, or better medical care for the elderly in the household. It's not for her, but it's for the household as a unit, different components of it. Is this a good outcome? Yes. How do we track the fact that she's able to do this and that gives her some new standing in the household? It's very difficult to see this, and particularly in the short or medium term. We must wait for these things to play out on a longer horizon to see whether social changes are showing up in other ways, in her freedom to leave, to take a bus and visit friends if without asking for permission. We don't get to record any of this stuff. Those are social changes, and it's tough. I think we should stick with, the household is better off, right?
Thanks, they answered it. I would have got shot if I had answered it the same way.
Okay. You're welcome, Varun.
On that note, I think it was a really spirited kind of conversation, and if I were to just bring it down to a few points that at least I'm taking away, is that one, the objective, the government does play the role of redistribution from those who have to those who don't, with the basic objective of reducing poverty, like improving the resilience and well-being of households. And Untied cash transfers is a great way to do that, simply because it doesn't put the onus of deciding for the citizen or the responsibility on the government, and it kind of builds agency and improves economic outcomes on field. I think some of the things that we were not fully able to touch upon is that what does it mean for some of the existing legacy schemes that we continue to carry on, and how can these be more meaningfully integrated into a welfare portfolio. But we've already got an invitation for a second round debate, so we'll probably touch upon it in that. But thank you for being an engaged audience, and any questions we could always take it offline. So thank you, Susan, and thank you, Varun.
Thanks, Pankuri. Thanks.